In 390 before Christ, a warrior named Brennus dropped a sword onto a Roman scale and uttered words that would haunt an empire for centuries. The Celts had just burned Rome to the ground, and no one in the Mediterranean world had ever heard of them before that day. Yet these were no sudden barbarians. They were the heirs of a civilization already 1,000 years old. This is the complete story of the Celtic world, from its deepest roots in the Bronze Age cremation fields of Central Europe to the salt lords of Hallstatt, the artistic revolution of La Tène, the great migrations that shook Greece and Rome, the fortified cities that rivaled anything in the ancient world, the druids who memorized libraries in their minds, and the warriors who fought naked against legions. We will walk through Caesar's brutal conquest, the last stand at Alesia, the unconquered green of Ireland, the golden age of monastic art, the centuries of siege by Vikings and Normans, and the long twilight of suppression. And then we will witness something rare in history, a civilization that refused to die, rising again in language, song, and sovereign identity in our own time. 6 living languages still carry the sound of Iron Age Europe on modern tongues. Over 800,000 people speak Welsh today. The Celtic story is not ancient history. It is still being written. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where all Celtic roads begin, in the river valleys of Bronze Age Europe, where the first embers of this world were already glowing. A thin column of smoke rises from a clearing in the forest. Then another. Then dozens more, scattered across a river terrace where the upper Danube bends through limestone hills. The fires are small, deliberately fed, and they burn hot enough to reduce a human body to calcite fragments. When the flames die, hands gather the pale remains into ceramic vessels, urns shaped with care, sometimes decorated with incised lines or raised knobs, and lower them into shallow pits. Row upon row, generation upon generation, the dead accumulate in ordered fields. No great mounds mark these graves. No single burial dominates. The community of the dead mirrors the community of the living. Numerous, organized, bound by shared custom across distances that would take weeks to walk. This is Central Europe around 1300 years before the Common Era. The world that will one day be called Celtic does not yet exist by any name. But its foundations are being laid in these cremation cemeteries, the Urnfield culture, named by modern archaeologists for the one practice that unites hundreds of communities from the Carpathian Basin to the Atlantic coast of France, from the North European plain to the foothills of the Alps. Between roughly 1300 and 750 years before the Common Era, this funerary tradition spread across a territory larger than any Bronze Age state, carried not by conquest or empire, but by kinship networks, trade, migration, and the slow diffusion of shared belief. The landscape these people inhabit is dense with oak, beech, and lime forest, broken by river corridors that serve as highways. Along the alpine forelands, settlements perch on timber platforms driven into the shallows of lakes, the Pfahlbauten, or pile dwellings, preserved in waterlogged sediment for millennia. Their inhabitants farm emmer wheat and barley on cleared terraces, raise cattle and pigs, and fish the cold alpine waters. But they are not isolated villagers. Bronze requires tin and copper drawn from mines, sometimes hundreds of kilometers distant. The need for metal creates roots, and roots create relationships. Bronze hoards buried in bogs and riverbanks testify to the scale of this exchange. Swords with leaf-shaped blades, cast in two-piece molds, appear in nearly identical forms from Hungary to Ireland. Shields of hammered sheet bronze, too thin for real combat, serve as symbols of warrior status displayed at feasts and deposited as offerings to water and earth. Socketed axes, sickles, and ornamental pins move along the Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, and their tributaries. Amber from the Baltic reaches the Mediterranean. Cypriot copper ingots, shaped like ox hides, appear north of the Alps. Within this network, a shared language is slowly crystallizing. Linguists reconstruct it as Proto-Celtic, a branch of the Indo-European family that diverged sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era, likely in the zone between the Upper Danube and the Carpathians. No written record preserves it. Its existence is inferred from the later Celtic languages and from river names Danuvius, Rhenus, Sequana, that carry forms older than any historical tongue recorded in these regions. The Urnfield world is not a state. It has no capital, no king of kings, no written law. Yet its consistency across vast distances reveals something powerful, a cultural grammar shared by communities who recognized one another as kin, as trading partners, as people who burned their dead and placed them in the earth the same way. Toward the 8th century before the Common Era, a new metal begins to appear in these graves. Iron, harder to work, but far more abundant than bronze. Its mastery will transform the social order, concentrate wealth in fewer hands, and give rise to the first civilization that outsiders will call by a name. But for now, the Urnfield fires still burn along the rivers of Europe, tending the roots of a world not yet born. Iron changes everything, not gradually, not gently, but with the force of a new order imposed upon the old. Where bronze required tin traded from distant Cornwall or Afghanistan, iron ore lies buried in bogs and hillsides across Central Europe, abundant, democratic in its distribution, yet demanding in its craft. The smiths who master it around 800 before the Common Era do not share their knowledge freely. They become powerful men, attached to powerful households, and the chieftains who control both the smiths and the ore deposits rise above their neighbors with a swiftness the Urnfield world never knew. In the narrow valley above the Hallstätter Sea, high in the Austrian Alps, shafts descend into solid rock salt. The mines here are ancient, worked since the Middle Bronze Age, but now, in the early first millennium before the Common Era, they reach an industrial scale. Miners carry leather backpacks down timber-braced tunnels, hacking at salt faces with bronze and iron picks, hauling crystalline blocks to the surface where they enter trade networks spanning the continent. Salt preserves meat, cures hides, and flavors food in an age without refrigeration. It is, pound for pound, as precious as metal. The community that controls this deposit grows wealthy beyond any measure the region has previously known. The cemetery on the slopes above the lake accumulates over 1,000 graves between roughly 800 and 400 before the Common Era. When Georg Ramsauer begins systematic excavation in 1846, he uncovers a world. Long iron swords with elaborate hilts, bronze vessels, amber beads from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, glass from the Mediterranean. These are not the egalitarian cremation urns of the preceding age. These are ranked burials, some lavish, most modest, revealing a society stratified into warrior aristocrats, skilled artisans, and dependent laborers. Archaeologists divide this civilization into two broad phases. Hallstatt C, spanning roughly 800 to 600 before the Common Era, is defined by long slashing swords and equestrian gear, a mounted warrior elite. Hallstatt D, from 600 to roughly 480 before the Common Era, sees a shift toward shorter daggers and an explosion of prestige goods imported from Greek and Etruscan workshops. The chieftains of this later phase do not merely trade with the Mediterranean. They consume its luxury culture, adapting it to their own purposes. At the Heuneberg, a fortified hilltop settlement overlooking the upper Danube in what is now southwestern Germany, something extraordinary appears around 600 before the Common Era. A mud brick wall built on stone foundations in a distinctly Mediterranean technique, complete with projecting rectangular bastions. Nothing like it exists elsewhere north of the Alps at this date. Someone, a chieftain, an architect, perhaps a Greek craftsman in residence, has transplanted southern building methods into the heart of temperate Europe. The settlement thrives as a center of craft and exchange for nearly a century before its destruction by fire. 50 kilometers to the south, the Hochdorf burial, dating to around 530 before the Common Era, preserves a chieftain laid upon a bronze couch, draped in gold-embroidered textiles, surrounded by a four-wheeled wagon, drinking horns, and a massive bronze cauldron filled with mead residue. His shoes bear gold plaques, his dagger is sheathed in gold. He is not merely wealthy, he is performing a role that connects earthly power to otherworldly authority. Further west, at Vix, near the headwaters of the Seine, a woman of extraordinary status is buried around 500 before the Common Era beneath a mound, accompanied by the largest bronze crater ever found in the ancient world, a Greek vessel standing 1.64 meters tall, capable of holding over 1,000 liters. Its presence here, far from any Greek city, testifies to diplomatic gift exchange at the highest level between Celtic elites and Mediterranean states. It is in this era that the first written name appears. Around 517 before the Common Era, the Greek geographer Hecataeus of Miletus mentions the Keltoi, people living in the hinterland beyond the Greek colony of Massalia. A world that had existed without external naming now enters the written record. The salt lords, the iron chieftains, the wagon-buried aristocrats of the Alpine highlands, they have become visible to history. But visibility does not guarantee permanence. Within a single generation of Hecataeus writing that name, the old Hallstatt order begins to fracture. The great princely seats of the Upper Danube and the Western Alps, the Heuneberg, the Hohenasperg, Mont Lassois, decline or fall silent. Their burial mounds cease to accumulate treasure. The trade routes that carried Mediterranean wine and bronze northward shift, reroute, or collapse. Something is ending, and something else, further north, is being born. Along the Middle Rhine, in the forested uplands of the Hunsrück-Eifel region, and eastward into the Marne Valley of what is now northeastern France, a new elite emerges in the decades around 480 before the Common Era. Their graves tell a different story from the Hallstatt wagon burials. These warriors ride not four-wheeled ceremonial wagons, but light, fast, two-wheeled chariots, vehicles built for speed, for display, for war. The chariot burials of the Marne, dozens of them clustered in flat cemeteries rather than beneath towering mounds, mark a decisive shift in how power is expressed. Authority no longer rests solely on controlling salt mines and alpine passes. It rests on mobility, on martial skill, on personal prowess demonstrated in combat and raid. The art that accompanies these burials is unlike anything Europe has produced before. On bronze flagons, on gold drinking horns, on the curved plates of iron scabbards, a new visual language unfolds. Tendrils curl and bifurcate. Lotus palmettes borrowed from Greek and Etruscan metalwork dissolve into abstraction. Half plant, half face, neither fully one nor the other. The Kleinersbergel burial, near Stuttgart, yields a gold-covered drinking horn decorated with ram heads and vegetal scrollwork that transforms Mediterranean motifs into something restless, ambiguous, alive. This is Latin art in its earliest flowering, named for the site on the northern shore of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where thousands of iron weapons, tools, and ornaments were recovered from shallow waters beginning in 1857. The Latin type site itself, a place of votive deposition where swords, spearheads, shields, and human remains were cast into the lake, speaks to a ritual world as transformed as the artistic one. Sacred offerings at watery boundaries suggest beliefs about thresholds between worlds, about the power concentrated where land meets water. The earliest hints of what classical authors would later call druidic practice may belong to this era, a priestly class mediating between the seen and the unseen, though direct evidence remains elusive for this early period. Power has shifted northward. The Hunsrück-Eifel hill forts command river valleys that connect the Rhine to the Moselle and beyond. The Marne region controls routes linking the Seine basin to the Rhineland. These are not peripheral zones, they are crossroads. And the elites who dominate them are not passive recipients of Mediterranean culture. They consume Greek wine, yes, the coral-inlaid brooches and imported Attic pottery in their graves prove continued contact, but they remake what they receive. Every borrowed form is digested, abstracted, rendered into something that serves Celtic meaning rather than Greek aesthetics. The fibulae, the great decorative brooches that fasten cloaks, become canvases for this new art. Their bows curve into animal heads, their catch plates dissolve into spiraling tendrils. Iron swords lengthen, their scabbards engraved with paired dragons or flowing plant forms that seem to grow and shift as the eye follows them. This is art designed for movement, for bodies in motion, for warriors who display their status not in static tomb chambers, but on horseback, in procession, in the flash of decorated metal catching firelight. By 400 before the Common Era, Latin culture has spread across a vast arc from Bohemia to Brittany, from the Upper Danube to the English Channel. It is not an empire. There is no central authority, no capital, no unified state. It is a shared world of taste, technology, belief, and social organization, carried by kinship networks, marriage alliances, and the restless movement of warrior bands seeking land, cattle, and glory. The old Hallstatt heartland has been eclipsed. The future belongs to the chariot-riding, spiral-decorating, sword-bearing aristocrats of the north. And they are already looking southward, towards the rich plains beyond the Alps, where Etruscan cities grow fat, and a small republic on the Tiber has not yet learned to fear the name Celt. The passes open in late spring. Snow retreats up the granite faces of the Alps, revealing tracks worn smooth by generations of traders, hauling amber, tin, and salt between the northern forests and the Mediterranean world. But in the early decades of the 4th century before the Common Era, something different moves through these corridors. Not merchant caravans, war bands, thousands of warriors with their families, their cattle, their two-wheeled chariots dismantled and carried on pack animals, their iron long swords wrapped in oiled leather against the damp. They descend the southern slopes into a landscape unlike anything the northern forests offered. The Po Valley, flat and impossibly fertile, its black soil fed by snow-melt rivers, its fields already cultivated by Etruscan colonists and Italic farmers who watch the mountain passes with growing dread. The migrations come in waves. Livy, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier annalistic traditions, names the tribes. The Insubres arrive first, settling around what will become Mediolanum. The Cenomani follow, establishing themselves near Brixia and Verona. The Boii push further south toward Bononia. And the Senones, the most aggressive, the most restless, press deepest into the peninsula, occupying the Adriatic coastal strip south of the Rubicon. Within 2 generations, the entire Po Valley has been transformed. Etruscan cities like Felsina and Melpum fall or are absorbed. A new cultural landscape emerges, Celtic in language and social organization, yet increasingly shaped by contact with Etruscan and Greek material culture. The newcomers mint no coins yet, build no stone cities, but their hilltop settlements and open villages spread across the richest agricultural land in Italy. Rome, in 390 before the Common Era, is still a modest city-state, dominant in Latium, but far from the imperial power it will become. Its army is a citizen militia organized by wealth and equipped with Bronze Age tactics barely adapted to the new century. When a band of Senones under a war leader the Romans will remember as Brennus moves south, perhaps drawn by a dispute involving the Etruscan city of Clusium, the Republic responds with characteristic confidence. 4 legions march north to the river Allia, 11 miles from Rome. The battle, fought on the 18th of July by later Roman reckoning, is not a contest. It is a rout. The Celtic charge, massed warriors screaming, their lime-stiffened hair rising like crests, their long iron blades outreaching Roman short swords, shatters the Roman line before it can properly form. The legions break, survivors flee to Veii. The road to Rome lies open. 3 days later, the Senones enter the city. Most of the population has fled. The garrison retreats to the Capitoline Hill, where the sacred geese of Juno and a small force of defenders hold out for 7 months. The rest of Rome burns. Temples, archives, wooden houses, centuries of accumulated civic memory reduced to ash. When negotiations finally end the siege, the price is 1,000 pounds of gold. Later tradition preserves the moment when Roman tribunes protest that the Celtic weights are false, and Brennus throws his sword onto the scales with the words that will echo through Roman memory for 500 years. Woe to the vanquished. The Senones withdraw northward with their gold. Rome rebuilds, frantically, chaotically, the new street plan a tangle that will persist for centuries. But the psychological wound cuts deeper than any physical destruction. The Dies Aliensis becomes a day of ill omen on the Roman calendar. The trauma reshapes Roman military doctrine, Roman foreign policy, Roman identity itself. Never again will the Republic allow a threat to approach unchecked. The Servian wall rises around the city, massive tufa blocks encircling the 7 hills. The army reforms, adopting the manipular system that will prove flexible enough to face Celtic charges without breaking. For the Celts of Cisalpine Gaul, the sack of Rome is not a turning point, but an episode. One raid among many in a world where cattle stealing and warrior glory define masculine worth. They settle into their new lands, farm, trade, intermarry with Italic peoples, and gradually develop the hybrid culture that archaeology reveals in their cemeteries. Latin swords beside Etruscan bronze vessels, Celtic talks paired with Greek pottery. They do not know that the city they burned will spend the next 3 centuries methodically conquering every Celtic settlement south of the Alps, driven by a memory that refuses to fade. While the Western Celts settle into the rich farmland of the Po Valley, a parallel current of migration pulses eastward along the Danube corridor. The great river has always been a highway, its broad floodplain offering passage through the forested heart of Europe toward the Black Sea. By the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, Celtic tribes are pressing into the middle Danube basin, into lands that are today Hungary, Serbia, and Romania. They move not as a single army, but as a shifting constellation of war bands, extended families, and entire tribal communities seeking land, plunder, and the warrior prestige that defines their social order. The Danube opens before them like a corridor of invitation. Flat grasslands stretch along its banks, interrupted by wooded hills and tributary valleys. Celtic settlements appear in the archaeological record across the Carpathian Basin. Latin metalwork, chariot fittings, iron weapons deposited in graves alongside local Illyrian and Thracian goods. These are not merely raiders passing through. They are colonizers, establishing permanent communities, intermarrying with indigenous populations, and gradually extending their reach toward the Balkans. By 335 before the Common Era, Celtic warbands are raiding into Illyria and Thrace. They encounter the northern periphery of the Hellenistic world, the successor kingdoms carved from Alexander's empire, now weakened by internal conflict. Macedon, once the mightiest military state in the Greek world, has been destabilized by dynastic wars following Alexander's death. Celtic ambassadors reportedly meet Alexander himself around 335, and when asked what they fear most, they answer that they fear only that the sky might fall upon them. Whether the anecdote is historical or literary invention, it captures the Greek perception of Celtic fearlessness. The real storm breaks after 300. Celtic pressure on Macedon intensifies through the early 3rd century. In 281, a massive Celtic force under a chieftain named Bulgios defeats and kills the Macedonian king Ptolemy Karaunos. His severed head is carried on a Celtic spear, a trophy in keeping with the Celtic cult of the head, now displayed before horrified Greek observers. Macedon lies open, its army shattered. 2 years later, in 279, a second great expedition assembles under a leader the Greeks call Brennus, a title or name echoing the earlier sacker of Rome, though this is a different man entirely. His force numbers perhaps 30,000 warriors, accompanied by families and wagons. They push south through the mountain passes of Thessaly, aiming for the richest prize in the Greek world, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, swollen with centuries of votive offerings in gold and silver. The Greeks rally at Thermopylae, that narrow coastal pass where Persians were once held. But the Celts find the mountain paths, as the Persians did before them, and turn the position. They press into central Greece. At Delphi itself, tradition holds that divine intervention, Earthquakes, thunderstorms, rockfalls scattered the Celtic attackers. Modern historians suspect a more prosaic combination of Greek resistance, harsh winter weather, and overextended supply lines. Brennus is wounded. The retreat becomes a rout. He dies, perhaps by his own hand, and the shattered remnants stream northward. Yet not all return home. A contingent of perhaps 20,000 warriors, invited by the Bithynian king Nicomedes I as mercenaries in his local wars, crosses the Hellespont into Asia Minor around 278. These Celts, three tribes known as the Trochmi, the Tolistobogi, and the Tectosages, settle on the high central plateau of Anatolia. The Greeks call them Galatai, and their territory becomes Galatia. They establish themselves as a warrior aristocracy, ruling over the indigenous Phrygian population, raiding neighboring Hellenistic kingdoms for tribute and plunder. Their council meets at a sacred oak grove called Drunameton, the name itself purely Celtic, meaning sacred grove, carried thousands of kilometers from its European origins into the heart of Asia Minor. Here, on the wind-swept Anatolian steppe, Celtic language, law, and ritual persist for centuries, the easternmost permanent outpost of the Celtic world, a testament to the extraordinary reach of a people who never built an empire, yet scattered their presence from the Atlantic to the Halys River. But the Celtic world does not only expand outward. In the centuries following the Great Migrations, something unprecedented takes shape within the continental heartland, a transformation as profound as any conquest. Across the arc of territory stretching from central France through southern Germany to Bohemia, Celtic communities begin concentrating into settlements of a scale and complexity never before seen north of the Alps. These are the Oppida, fortified proto-cities that represent the highest material achievement of independent Celtic civilization. The hilltop of Mont-Beauvray in Burgundy rises above the surrounding forests, its summit enclosed by nearly 5 kilometers of rampart. This is Bibracte, capital of the Iadui, and by the 2nd century before the Common Era, it shelters perhaps 10,000 inhabitants within its walls. The fortification itself is a masterwork of engineering, the Murus Gallicus, a technique Caesar himself will later describe with grudging admiration. Horizontal timber beams are laid in alternating courses, pinned together with long iron nails, the gaps between filled with rubble and faced with dressed stone. The result is a wall that absorbs the impact of battering rams, resists fire because the stone smothers the timber, and stands with a solidity that rivals Mediterranean masonry. Inside these walls, the settlement is organized into distinct quarters. Metalworkers cluster in one district, their forges glowing with iron, bronze, and enamel work. Nearby, minters strike coins, small gold and silver pieces whose designs derive ultimately from Macedonian staters brought back by Celtic mercenaries generations earlier, now abstracted into swirling patterns barely recognizable as the original portrait of Philip II. Glass bead workshops produce ornaments in vivid blue, yellow, and white. Potters shape wheel-thrown vessels. The streets, though unpaved, follow planned alignments between timber-framed buildings roofed in thatch. At Manching in Bavaria, on the flat plain north of the Danube, another oppidum sprawls across nearly 400 hectares, enclosed by a rampart stretching 7 kilometers in circumference. Excavations reveal warehouses stacked with Mediterranean amphorae that once held Italian wine, traded northward along the Rhones and Saône corridors in exchange for furs, slaves, salted meat, and raw metals. The sheer volume of imported wine amphorae at Celtic sites testifies to a trade network of remarkable sophistication, linking Roman merchants at Narbo and Massalia to tribal elites deep in the continental interior. In Bohemia, the oppidum of Zavist commands a strategic position above the Vltava River, its multiple enclosures and ritual precinct suggesting both political and religious authority concentrated in a single fortified centre. Across Europe, over 200 such sites are known, from Numantia in Iberia to Stradonice in Bohemia, from Entremont in Provence to Kelheim on the Danube. These are not cities in the Mediterranean sense. They lack the monumental stone architecture, the written legal codes, the permanent bureaucracies of Greek polis or Roman municipia. Yet they represent genuine urbanization, permanent populations engaged in specialized craft production, monetary exchange, long-distance commerce, and centralized political decision-making. Celtic coinage, first minted around 300 before the Common Era in imitation of Macedonian gold, has by this period diversified into dozens of regional types, each tribe issuing its own designs, some bearing names in Greek or Latin script, others purely abstract. The existence of coinage implies markets, taxation, standardized value, and political authority capable of guaranteeing that value. The oppida mark the moment when Celtic civilization reaches its material zenith on the continent. Trade routes stretch from the Baltic amber coast to the Mediterranean shore. Iron production achieves industrial scale. Agricultural surpluses support non-farming populations of artisans, warriors, priests, and merchants. Political authority consolidates around councils of nobles meeting within fortified walls rather than in open-air assemblies. The Celtic world stands on the threshold of something that might, given centuries of uninterrupted development, have evolved into true statehood. But those centuries will not be granted. The oppida hum with commerce and craft, but their walls do not contain the full architecture of Celtic power. There exists another structure, invisible, unwritten, carried entirely in memory and voice, that binds the tribes more deeply than any rampart of timber and stone. This is the domain of the Druids, in oak groves set apart from settlement and field, where canopy filters light into green silence, the intellectual elite of the Celtic world gathers. These are not merely priests. They are judges who arbitrate disputes between tribes, astronomers who calculate the movements of moon and sun, philosophers who debate the nature of the soul, and educators who train the next generation in a curriculum lasting as long as 20 years. Caesar, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, records that Druidic students memorize vast quantities of verse, cosmology, law, genealogy, natural philosophy, and that committing sacred knowledge to writing is strictly forbidden. The prohibition is deliberate. Power resides in the living voice, in the trained memory, in the person of the Druid, rather than in any text that might be copied, stolen, or misread. The Coligny calendar, discovered in fragments in eastern Gaul, reveals the sophistication of Druidic astronomy. Cast in bronze during the late 2nd or early 1st century before the Common Era, it maps a lunisolar cycle of 62 consecutive months, marking days as fortunate or unfortunate, tracking the reconciliation of lunar months with the solar year. This is not folk reckoning. It is systematic observation accumulated across generations. 4 great festivals divide the Celtic year: Samhain, at the onset of winter darkness around the 1st of November, marks the boundary between the living and the dead, a night when the other world opens. Imbolc in early February honors the stirring of new life beneath frozen ground. Beltane at the 1st of May celebrates fire and fertility, cattle driven between twin blazes for purification. Lughnasadh in August marks the harvest and the games sacred to the god Lugh. Each festival carries obligations of sacrifice, feasting, and assembly. Sacrifice itself takes many forms. Votive deposits fill lakes, rivers, and bogs across the Celtic world. At Lyn Cherig Bach on Anglesey, iron weapons, chariot fittings, slave chains, and animal bones were cast into a shallow lake over 2 centuries, offerings to powers beneath the water. Ritual shafts sunk deep into the earth contain layered deposits of animal remains, broken pottery, and human bone. The Gundestrup cauldron, found dismantled in a Danish bog but crafted with imagery drawn from Celtic and Thracian traditions, depict scenes of ritual immersion, antlered deities, and warriors marching toward a great vessel. Whether human sacrifice occurred remains debated. Classical authors insist upon it, wicker figures filled with living victims drowning in sacred pools, triple killing by wound, rope, and water. Archaeology confirms some violent ritual deaths. The bog bodies of northern Europe show individuals killed with deliberate ceremony. Yet the scale and regularity that Roman writers describe may reflect propaganda as much as practice. Beside the Druids stand the bards, filled in later Irish tradition, who preserve tribal memory in verse. Genealogies stretching back generations, praise poems for living kings, satires capable of destroying reputations, and epic narratives of divine and heroic deeds all exist only in performance. The bard's voice carries legal weight. A justified satire can strip a king of honor. Women move through this sacred world with authority that surprises Mediterranean observers. Druidesses are attested in later sources. Female burials of extraordinary wealth, the Vix princess among the earliest, suggest women holding political and perhaps ritual power. The severed head, carved in stone at sanctuaries like Roquepertouse and Entremont in southern Gaul, stares from niches with hollow eyes, the head as seat of the soul, trophy of war, and object of veneration simultaneously. This invisible architecture, calendar, festival, sacrifice, verse, judgment, and prophecy, holds the Celtic world together where political unity cannot. It is the shared grammar of belief across dozens of independent peoples, from Galatia to Ireland. And it is precisely this cohesion that Rome will eventually recognize as dangerous, targeting Druidic centers for destruction with the same strategic logic applied to enemy fortifications. Far to the west, beyond the Pyrenees and the green river valleys of southern Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula holds its own Celtic world, one shaped not by Alpine passes and Danubian trade routes, but by the vast wind-scoured plateau of the Meseta. Here, at elevations exceeding 700 meters, the land stretches in rolling brown expanses broken by scrub oak and seasonal rivers that run dry under summer sun. Celtic-speaking peoples arrived in waves across the western Pyrenees, beginning around the 6th century before the Common Era, filtering into the interior highlands, where they encountered and merged with indigenous Iberian populations. The result was something neither purely Celtic nor purely Iberian, a hybrid civilization the Romans would call Celtiberian, concentrated in the upper Ebro and Duero river basins. Their settlements crown the hilltops of the Meseta in tight clusters of stone and mud brick. The Castro, a fortified hilltop village ringed by concentric walls, ditches and fields of sharpened stones called piedras hincadas, defines the landscape from Galicia in the northwest to the Celtiberian heartland around modern Soria and Guadalajara. Houses pressed together in narrow streets, their walls of dry stacked limestone, their roofs of thatch or flat clay. In Galicia and northern Portugal, the castros of the Galaici shelter circular stone dwellings with carved doorposts and granite granaries raised on stilts. Farther east, Celtiberian towns grow larger and more complex, Numantia, Tiames, Segida, with rectangular houses, public spaces, and defensive circuits of extraordinary sophistication. The material culture blends traditions with startling fluidity. Warriors carry the falcata, a curved, single-edged sword of Iberian origin, alongside straight Celtic longswords and round shields. Bronze fibulae display lateen spirals adapted into local geometric patterns. Painted pottery bears stylized horses, warriors, and hunting scenes in a distinctly Iberian artistic vocabulary. The tessera hospitalis, small bronze plaques shaped as clasped hands, animals, or geometric forms, records pacts of mutual hospitality between individuals and communities in Celtiberian script, an adaptation of Iberian writing to render a Celtic language. This script itself embodies the fusion, a syllabary designed for a non-Indo-European tongue now serving Celtic speech. Massive stone sculptures of bulls and boars, the veracos, stand sentinel at settlement entrances and in pastures across the western Meseta. Some reach 2 meters in length, carved from single granite blocks with minimal detail yet unmistakable power. They mark territory, honor pastoral wealth, perhaps invoke protective spirits over herds that constitute the primary measure of status. When Rome turns its attention to Iberia after the Second Punic War, it encounters in these peoples a resistance unlike anything faced in the eastern Mediterranean. The Celtiberian Wars begin in 181 before the Common Era and grind on for nearly half a century. Roman commanders repeatedly underestimate the terrain, the guerrilla tactics, and the sheer determination of peoples defending ancestral land. Viriathus, a Lusitanian shepherd turned war leader, wages a devastating campaign of ambush and rapid movement from 147 to 139 before the Common Era, humiliating successive Roman armies until his assassination by bribed companions. Numantia becomes the final symbol. A modest hilltop city of perhaps 4,000 inhabitants on the upper Duero, it defies Rome for 20 years. Consul after consul fails before its walls. In 134 before the Common Era, Scipio Aemilianus arrives with 60,000 troops and constructs a circumvallation of 7 kilometers. Siege walls, towers, and camps encircling the city entirely. After 8 months of starvation, the Numantines choose mass suicide over surrender. In 133 before the Common Era, Scipio enters a city of corpses and razed it to its foundations. The destruction is total and deliberate, a message written in ash across the Meseta. Celtic independence in Iberia ends not with a treaty, but with annihilation. Decades before Caesar will face the same question in Gaul. The same logic of annihilation that consumed Numantia now turns northward. In 58 before the Common Era, Gaius Julius Caesar, proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul and Illyricum, marches his legions beyond the provincial frontier and into the heart of free Celtic territory. He carries with him debts measured in thousands of talents, political ambitions that require military glory, and the legal pretext of a migrating people. The Helvetii, a confederation of tribes in modern Switzerland, have burned their own settlements and begun moving westward toward the Atlantic coast. Caesar intercepts them near Bibracte, the great oppidum of the Aedui, and in a single brutal engagement destroys their column. Of 368,000 migrants recorded in their own census tablets, written in Greek script, found in the abandoned camp, Caesar claims only 110,000 survive to be sent home. It is the opening stroke of a war that will last 8 years and reshape the continent. The structure of Gaul itself makes conquest possible. Between 60 and 100 distinct tribes occupy the territory from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Atlantic to the Alps. They share language, religion, artistic tradition, and social customs, but not political unity. The Aedui are rivals of the Arverni. The Sequani feud with both. The Remi seek advantage through early alliance with Rome. The Belgi in the north distrust the southern tribes. Caesar exploits every fracture. His method is consistent. Identify a tribal dispute, intervene as arbiter or ally, then impose permanent obligation. Those who resist face annihilation. Those who submit become clients, bound by hostage and tribute. In 57 before the Common Era, Caesar turned against the Belgi, the fiercest warriors in Gaul by his own account. The Nervi ambush his column at the Sabis River and nearly overwhelm 2 legions before Roman discipline and reinforcement reverse the battle. 56 seas campaigns against the Veneti, the great seafaring tribe of Armorica, whose tall-sided ships dominate the Atlantic coast. Caesar builds a fleet, equips it with hooks to cut enemy rigging, and destroys Venete naval power in a single engagement in Quiberon Bay. The entire Senate of the Veneti is executed. Their people are sold into slavery. 55 and 54 bring expeditions across the Rhine, a bridge built in 10 days as a demonstration of engineering supremacy, and 2 crossings to Britain, more reconnaissance than conquest. But the Continental War intensifies. In 54, the Eburones under Ambiorix destroy a legion and 5 cohorts in winter quarters. Caesar retaliates with systematic devastation of Eburones' territory, offering bounty to neighboring tribes who hunt survivors. By 53, Gaul smolders with resentment. 8 years of requisitions, hostage-taking, mass enslavement, and punitive campaigns have created not submission, but fury. The Carnutes strike first, massacring Roman traders at Cenabum in the winter of 52. Within days, word spreads across Gaul through the network of tribal messengers. A young Arvernian nobleman, Vercingetorix, son of Celtillus, who once held supremacy over all Gaul, seizes leadership. He is elected king by acclamation and forges what no Celtic leader has achieved in living memory. A coalition spanning dozens of tribes, from the Bituriges to the Parisii, united against a common enemy. Vercingetorix understands that Celtic warriors cannot match Roman legions in pitched battle. He adopts a scorched earth strategy, burning grain stores, destroying oppida, denying Caesar forage and supply. The Bituriges beg him to spare Avaricum, their greatest city, insisting its natural defences are impregnable. Vercingetorix relents. Caesar besieges Avaricum for 25 days in freezing rain, his soldiers starving, then storms the walls. 40,000 inhabitants are put to the sword. Only 800 escape. Yet at Gergovia, the Arvernian capital, Vercingetorix achieves what seems impossible, a tactical defeat of Caesar's legions. Roman forces assault the hill fort prematurely, lose 700 legionaries and 46 centurions, and withdraw. It is Caesar's only significant reverse in Gaul. The victory electrifies the coalition. Even the Aedui, Rome's oldest Gallic allies, defect to Vercingetorix. For a brief season in 52 before the Common Era, Free Gaul stands united, and Rome's grip on the north trembles. But unity is not enough. After Gergovia, Vercingetorix makes the decision that will define the war's final act. He retreats with 80,000 warriors to the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a natural stronghold on a lozenge-shaped plateau rising above the plain of Les Laumes, flanked by two rivers, the Ouse and the Osserin. The site commands views in every direction. Its slopes are steep, its water supply adequate. Vercingetorix believes he can hold here while a relief army gathers from every corner of Free Gaul. He sends riders out before the Roman net closes, carrying appeals to the Aedui, the Bellovaci, the Arverni, the Lemovices, to every tribe that still breathes free. Caesar arrives in late summer of 52 before the Common Era and sees the plateau's strength immediately. He does not assault it. Instead, he orders something unprecedented in scale, a double ring of fortification that will trap the defenders inside while protecting his own legions from attack without. The inner ring, the circumvallation, stretches 18 kilometers around the base of Alesia's plateau. The outer ring, the contravallation, faces outward across the surrounding plains, extending 21 kilometers. Between them, Roman legionaries dig trenches, raise timber palisades, construct 23 redoubts, and plant fields of sharpened stakes concealed in pits, the lilies, as the soldiers call them. Iron-tipped caltrops litter the approaches. The engineering consumes weeks. Tens of thousands of legionaries work in shifts, cutting timber from surrounding forests, hauling earth, driving stakes. The landscape transforms into a machine of containment. Inside Alesia, food dwindles. 80,000 warriors and the town's civilian population consume stores at a devastating rate. Vercingetorix orders the expulsion of non-combatants, women, children, the elderly of the Mandubi, the local tribe whose oppidum this is. They stream down the slopes toward the Roman lines, begging passage. Caesar refuses to let them through. They remain in the no-man's land between wall and fortress, starving in sight of both armies. It is a cruelty that neither side will claim. Then the relief army arrives. Ancient sources place its strength at 250,000, a figure almost certainly inflated. But the force is enormous, drawn from dozens of tribes, commanded by Commius of the Atrebates, Vercassivellaunus of the Arverni, and others. They crash against the outer Roman wall in successive waves. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix leads sorties from the plateau against the inner fortifications. Caesar's legions fight on two fronts, pivoting between circumvallation and contravallation, rushing reserves to threatened sectors. For 3 days, the battle rages. At the crisis point, Germanic cavalry in Caesar's service strike the relief army's flank. The outer assault collapses. The relief force scatters into the countryside. On the plateau, Vercingetorix watches the dust of his last hope receding across the plain. The following day he dons his finest armor, mounts his war horse, rides down to Caesar's position, circles the Roman general's seat, dismounts, and lays his weapons at Caesar's feet. The gesture carries the weight of an entire civilization's surrender. He is taken in chains to Rome, held in the Tullianum prison for 6 years, then paraded in Caesar's triumph of 46 before the Common Era and strangled in the traditional Roman manner. The fall of Alesia does not end all resistance. Through 51 and 50 before the Common Era, scattered revolts flare. The Bellovaci in the north, the Cadurci in the south, Uxellodunum, where Caesar orders the hands of all defenders severed as a final warning. But these are death spasms. The political structure of Free Gaul, its tribal councils, its seasonal confederations, its druidic arbitration, is broken beyond repair. Caesar imposes tribute of 40 million sesterces annually. Gallic aristocrats who cooperated receive Roman citizenship. Those who resisted lose lands, status, and often life. Within a generation, the sons of Gallic chieftains will speak Latin, wear togas, and compete for magistracies in Roman colonial towns built atop the ashes of Oppidar. The continent's Celtic heartland passes from sovereignty into memory. Across the narrow strait that separates Gaul from the island the Romans call Britannia, chalk cliffs rise white against grey water. Even as Caesar's legions crush the continental heartland, this island remains untouched, a world apart, connected to the Celtic mainland by trade, kinship, and shared language, yet developing along its own trajectory for centuries. Britain in the 1st century before the Common Era is not a single kingdom, but a mosaic of tribal territories, each governed by its own aristocracy, each fortified behind earthwork ramparts that crown the island's hills like crowns of beaten earth. Caesar himself crosses twice, in 55 and again in 54 before the Common Era, but these are reconnaissance expeditions, not conquests. His fleet struggles against channel tides. British charioteers harass his columns with a mobility his cavalry cannot match. He extracts hostages and tribute promises from the Trinovantes and other southeastern tribes, then withdraws to Gaul where the real war demands his attention. Britain buys nearly a century of independence through geography alone. During that century, southeastern Britain transforms. Trade with the Roman world intensifies. Amphorae of Italian wine arrive at Camulodunum, capital of the Catuvellauni under Cunobelinus, the King Shakespeare would later call Cymbeline. Gold coinage imitating Roman models circulates. Tribal politics shift as pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions compete. When Cunobelinus dies around 40 of the Common Era, his sons Togodumnus and Caratacus pursue aggressive expansion that destabilizes neighboring tribes. Refugees flee to Rome, providing Emperor Claudius the pretext he needs. In 43 of the Common Era, 4 legions under Aulus Plautius cross the Channel, roughly 40,000 men. The landing meets resistance at a river crossing, likely the Medway, where 2 days of fighting break British resistance in the southeast. Claudius himself arrives for the final advance on Camulodunum, reportedly accompanied by war elephants, animals never before seen on British soil. The spectacle is calculated, shock as statecraft. 11 British kings submit without further battle. But submission is not universal. Caratacus escapes westward, rallying the Silures and Ordovices of Wales for 8 years of guerrilla resistance before his capture in 51. He is paraded through Rome in chains, his dignity reportedly impressing Claudius enough to spare his life. Meanwhile, Roman roads push outward from Londinium and Camulodunum like veins through new flesh. The breaking point comes in 60 or 61. Roman forces under Suetonius Paulinus assault the island of Mona, Anglesey, the Druidic heartland. Tacitus describes the scene: druids raising arms in cursing, black-robed women shrieking among them, sacred groves burning as legionaries hack down oaks consecrated for generations. The spiritual centre of British Celtic religion is deliberately destroyed. At that precise moment, the Iceni of eastern Britain rise. Their queen Boudica, flogged by Roman officials, her daughters violated, leads a confederation of Iceni and Trinovantes in devastating revolt. Camulodunum burns. The undefended veteran colony is annihilated. Londinium burns. Verulamium burns. Cassius Dio claims 70,000 dead. Suetonius Paulinus races back from Anglesey, chooses ground carefully, and in a single pitched battle destroys Boudica's vast but undisciplined host. She dies shortly after, by poison, according to Tacitus. The revolt's failure seals Britain's fate. Subsequent governors consolidate control through roads, forts, and the slow machinery of Romanization. By 84 of the Common Era, Gnaeus Julius Agricola pushes into the Scottish Highlands, meeting the Caledonian Confederation under Calgacus at Mons Graupius. Tacitus places in Calgacus's mouth words that echo across centuries, a denunciation of empire's appetite. The Romans win the battle, but never hold the far north permanently. A frontier will harden here, eventually becoming Hadrian's Wall, marking the limit beyond which Celtic life continues unbroken by Roman order. South of that hardening frontier, the machinery of empire reshapes the Celtic world not through fire alone, but through stone, law, commerce, and time. The transformation is neither instant nor total. It unfolds across 4 centuries, and what emerges is not simply Roman. It is something layered, hybrid, and stubbornly rooted in older ground. In Gaul, the process begins within a generation of Alesia. Augustus divides the conquered territory into provinces: Gallia Narbonensis, Lugdunensis, Aquitania, Belgica, each administered from new capitals built on Celtic foundations. Lugdunum, modern Lyon, rises at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône as the administrative heart of the 3 Gauls. An altar to Roma and Augustus stands where tribal delegates once gathered. Celtic aristocrats, the very families who led resistance, now compete for priesthoods at this altar, trading martial prestige for civic honor. Within 2 generations, Gaulish nobles enter the Roman Senate. The Emperor Claudius himself, in 48 of the Common Era, argues before the Senate that Gauls deserve full membership in Roman governance. Yet beneath the forum pavements, older currents persist. The Gaulish language does not vanish. Inscriptions in Gaulish appear into the 2nd century. St. Irenaeus, writing in Lyon around 180 of the Common Era, complains of needing to preach in the local Celtic tongue. Graffiti scratched on pottery at La Grofezonc in southern Gaul records potters' tallies in Gaulish well into the imperial period. The language retreats slowly, surviving in rural districts perhaps into the 5th century, before finally yielding to vulgar Latin. Religion proves even more resilient. Across Gaul, Britain, and the Rhineland, hundreds of small square temples, fana, rise in a distinctly Celtic architectural form unknown in the Mediterranean. These are not Roman temples with columned porticos, but compact structures with an inner cellar surrounded by an ambulatory, oriented to local sacred sites. The gods worshipped within bear Roman names grafted onto Celtic identities: Mars Lucasius, Apollo Granus, Mercury Siconius. Each pairing reveals a negotiation between imperial religion and indigenous belief. The goddess Epona, protector of horses, travels with Roman cavalry across the empire, her cult spreading from Gaul to the Danube and beyond without ever losing its Celtic character. At Aquae Sulis, modern Bath, the hot springs sacred to the goddess Sulis merge with Minerva's cult, and pilgrims scratch curse tablets in Latin asking a Celtic deity for justice. The Pillar of the Boatmen, erected in Lutetia during the reign of Tiberius, captures this duality in stone. Celtic gods, Cernunnos with his antlers, Esus with his axe, share carved panels with Jupiter and Vulcan. The dedicators are Gaulish boatmen prospering under Roman trade, honoring both traditions simultaneously. In the countryside, rural villas spread across Gaul and Britain, their mosaic floors sometimes depicting Celtic motifs alongside classical scenes. The economy thrives on networks the Celts themselves established: wine, pottery, metalwork, textiles flowing along rivers and roads now paved by legionary engineers. Samian ware from Gaulish workshops supplies tables across the empire. But accommodation has limits. In 260 of the Common Era, Postumus, a commander on the Rhine frontier, declares a breakaway Gallic empire that endures 14 years, governing Gaul, Britain, and Hispania independently before reabsorption. A century later, the Bagaudae, bands of dispossessed peasants and rural poor in Gaul and Hispania, rise repeatedly against imperial authority, their revolts carrying echoes of older resistance. Roman writers dismiss them as bandits, but their persistence across decades suggests deeper fractures. By the 4th century, as the empire contracts and Germanic pressures mount, the Celtic substrate remains. Place names across France, Spain, and Britain preserve Celtic roots. Rivers especially, the Danube itself from Danuyos, the Rhine, the Thames, the Seine. When Roman administration finally withdraws from Britain after 410 of the Common Era, what resurfaces is not pristine Celtic culture, but something transformed, Christian, partially Latinized, yet still speaking Brittonic languages, still organized around kinship and local lordship. The centuries of Roman rule did not erase Celtic identity. They buried it beneath layers of stone and Latin, where it waited, patient as roots beneath pavement, for the empire's weight to lift. West of Britain, beyond the grey churn of the Irish Sea, lies an island that Rome never reached. No legionary boot pressed its soil, no surveyor's gromer measured its fields, no governor's edict reshaped its laws. While Gaul submitted, while Britain burned under Boudicca and then bent under 4 centuries of occupation, Ireland remained outside, not because Rome was unaware of it, but because the logistics of conquest across open Atlantic water against a land of bog, forest, and fragmented lordship never justified the cost. Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, mapped its coastline and named its tribes, the Iverni, the Brigantes, the Volunti, proving that Roman merchants and geographers knew this island well. Yet knowledge did not translate into invasion. Ireland developed on its own terms, and in doing so preserved a Celtic civilization in its fullest, most uninterrupted form. The landscape itself shapes everything. Drumlin hills roll across the Midlands. Lakes and rivers thread through Blanket Bog. The central limestone plain, ringed by coastal mountains, creates a world of enclosed horizons, small kingdoms defined by watershed and ridge. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Ireland is divided into over 150 tuatha, petty kingdoms each ruled by a rí, a king whose authority rests on cattle wealth, martial reputation, and the sanction of ritual. These tuatha cluster into larger provincial over-kingdoms, Ulaid in the north, Connacht in the west, Laigan in the east, Mumu in the south, and above them all, the symbolic high kingship claimed from the hill of Tara in Meath, though its actual power remains contested and ceremonial for much of this era. The material world is intimate in scale, but rich in craft. Ring forts, raths, dot the countryside in their tens of thousands, circular earthen enclosures surrounding farmsteads of timber and wattle. On lakes, crannogs rise on artificial islands, their wooden platforms offering security against cattle raiders. Latin artistic traditions persist here long after they vanish from the Romanized continent. Flowing spirals, trumpet curves, and abstracted animal forms adorn bronze horsebits, iron sword hilts, and gold dress fasteners. The Breutergold hoard, dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, includes a miniature gold boat, complete with oars, mast, and steering oar, testimony to Atlantic seafaring skill. Society is stratified but governed by elaborate law. The Fillid poets and seers hold status nearly equal to kings, their training lasting years, their satire feared as a weapon that can strip a ruler of honor. Druids persist here longer than anywhere else in the Celtic world, their role gradually merging with that of the Fillid as centuries pass. Cattle are currency, measure of wealth, cause of war. The great epic tradition of the Ulster cycle, though written down centuries later, preserves the memory of this world. Chu Chulin defending the ford, Queen Medb marshalling armies for the Tyne Bo Cuailnge, the great cattle raid that defines heroic society. By the 4th century, Ogham script appears, short lines carved on stone edges, encoding the Irish language in a system perhaps influenced by knowledge of Latin letters carried home by Irish who traded with or raided Roman Britain. These stones mark boundaries and graves, the earliest written Irish. Then, in 431, Pope Celestine sends Palladius to minister to Christians already living in Ireland, proof that the faith arrived through trade and contact before any formal mission. Within a generation, the figure known as Patrick, a Romano-British captive turned bishop, carries Christianity deeper into Irish society. The conversion happens not by conquest, but by persuasion, adaptation, and the slow absorption of Druidic learning into monastic frameworks. By 500, Ireland stands transformed yet continuous, Christian in faith, Celtic in language and law, monastic in its new intellectual centres, yet still organized around tuatha, cattle, kinship, and the ancient rhythms of Samhain and Beltane. What Rome could not conquer, the gospel entered gently, and the oldest unbroken Celtic civilization carried forward into a new age. On a rock pinnacle rising from the Atlantic swell, 7 miles off the Kerry coast, a stairway of 600 hand-cut steps climbs toward the sky. At the summit, 6 beehive huts of dry stacked stone cling to the edge of nothing. No mortar, no timber, only the precise corbelling of slate against Atlantic gales. This is Skellig Michael, and in the 6th century it becomes home to a small community of monks who have chosen the most extreme expression of a new spiritual impulse. Peregrinatio, voluntary exile from homeland and kin for the love of God. They are not fleeing the world. They are carrying the Celtic world forward into a new form. The monastic movement that transforms Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany between 500 and 800 of the Common Era does not follow the Roman model of episcopal dioceses governed from cities. There are no cities. Instead, monasteries become the organizing centers of intellectual, economic, and spiritual life, replacing the Druidic schools that once trained poets and judges over 20 years of oral apprenticeship. The new monasteries inherit that same appetite for learning, that same reverence for memorized knowledge, but now they possess what the Druids deliberately refused: the written word. In 563, Columba, an Irish prince of the Senel Conile, already founder of monasteries at Derry and Durrow, crosses to the island of Iona off the western Scottish coast. The monastery he establishes there becomes the most influential centre of Celtic Christianity for 2 centuries. From Iona, monks carry the faith to the Picts of northern Scotland, to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, and eventually back across the sea to continental Europe. Iona's scriptorium produces manuscripts of extraordinary beauty. The Book of Durrow, completed around 680, displays interlaced animal forms and carpet pages of spiraling color that fuse Latene artistic traditions with Christian iconography. Around 590, Columbanus departs Ireland with 12 companions and walks into the Frankish kingdoms. He founds Luxeuil in Burgundy, Bobbio in northern Italy, and inspires a chain of monasteries across Gaul, the Rhineland, and the Alps. Irish monks carry not only scripture, but classical Latin texts, Greek learning, and a fierce independence that clashes with Frankish bishops accustomed to Roman ecclesiastical order. The Irish calculate Easter differently, tonsure their monks differently, organize authority differently. These are not trivial disputes. They reflect 2 distinct visions of how the Church should function. The collision comes to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where King Oswiu of Northumbria rules in favor of Roman practice over the Celtic tradition brought from Iona to Lindisfarne. The decision does not destroy Celtic monasticism, but it begins its slow alignment with continental norms. Yet even as institutional independence fades, artistic brilliance intensifies. The Lindisfarne Gospels, completed around 715, represent a fusion of Celtic interlace, Germanic animal art, and Mediterranean figural tradition that has no parallel in contemporary Europe. And around 800 monks, likely working between Iona and the Irish Midlands, produce the Book of Kells. 280 vellum folios of such intricate decoration that a single capital letter contains worlds within worlds, spirals nested inside spirals, creatures devouring their own tails in endless loops of pigment and gold. These scriptoria preserve more than Christian texts. Irish monks copy Virgil, Horace, Cicero, and Greek grammarians. When Charlemagne seeks scholars for his palace school, he finds them among the Irish, men like Dicuil the geographer and Johannes Scotus Eriugena, the most original philosopher of the 9th century. The Celtic monastic world becomes a bridge between the classical past and the medieval future, carrying knowledge through centuries when much of Western Europe has lost the infrastructure of literacy. In stone-high crosses standing in monastery yards from Clonmacnoise to Monasterboice, biblical scenes merge with Celtic knotwork in open-air sermons carved for a people still rooted in oral tradition. The faith has been absorbed into Celtic forms, and Celtic civilization has found in monasticism a vessel strong enough to carry its genius across the centuries that follow. The monastery at Lindisfarne sits on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, its scriptorium housing gospels illuminated in the Celtic tradition, its monks living by rhythms unchanged for generations. On the 8th day of June, 793, dragon-proud ships appear from the North Sea. The raiders who pour ashore carry axes and a hunger for silver. They strip the altar, slaughter monks, drag others to their ships as slaves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with horror. But for the Celtic-speaking world, for Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, Lindisfarne is merely the first tremor of a catastrophe that will reshape everything the monastic age built. Within a decade, Norse longships probe every exposed coastline of the Celtic fringe. Iona, Columba's sacred island, suffers raids in 795, 802, and 860, the last killing 68 monks at a site remembered as Martyrs Bay. Rathlin Island, Inishmurray, Skellig Michael, no rock is too remote. The raiders target monasteries not from hatred of Christianity, but because these are the wealthiest institutions in lands without cities. Jeweled reliquaries, silver chalices, gilded book shrines, centuries of accumulated devotional wealth become plunder carried north to Scandinavian trading posts. By the 840s, the nature of Norse engagement shifts from raiding to settlement. A Viking fleet overwinters on Lough Neagh in 839. By 841, a fortified long fort stands at the mouth of the Liffey, the embryo of Dublin. Similar bases emerge at Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These are not mere camps but permanent trading towns, connected by sea routes to York, the Orkneys, Iceland, and the slave markets of the Mediterranean. Dublin becomes the largest slave trading centre in Western Europe. Irish annals record the disruption in terse grief. Churches burned, abbots killed, communities scattered. Yet the Celtic world does not simply suffer. Irish kings learn Norse tactics, hire Norse mercenaries, and contest control of the new port towns. The Vikings are drawn into Irish dynastic politics as allies, rivals, and eventually kin through intermarriage. By the mid-10th century, a hybrid Norse-Gaelic culture emerges, visible in Dublin's excavated layers, where Norse woodworking sits alongside Irish metalwork styles. In Scotland, Norse settlement transforms the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, and Caithness into a Scandinavian-speaking zone that persists for centuries. The decisive Irish response comes under Brian Boru, King of Dal Cas, who by the early 11th century has forced acknowledgement as High King from nearly every province. At Clontarf on Good Friday, 1014, his army defeats a coalition of Norse Dublin and Leinster forces. Brian himself dies in the battle, but Norse political power in Ireland is broken. Dublin survives as a trading city, increasingly Gaelicized. Yet scarcely a generation after Clontarf, a new threat emerges from Normandy, itself a land settled by Norsemen who adopted French speech and feudal order. Norman knights conquer England in 1066, then turn immediately toward Wales. By 1067, William Fitz-Osbern builds castles along the Welsh border. The Motte and Bailey, a raised earthwork crowned with timber tower, proves devastatingly effective against Welsh hill kingdoms accustomed to raiding warfare rather than siege. Norman lords carve out marcher territories in South Wales, pushing Welsh princes into the mountainous interior of Gwynedd and Powys. In Brittany, Norman influence absorbs the Breton duchy into the orbit of Anglo-Norman power. Breton knights fight at Hastings. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts them charging alongside Normans. Brittany retains its Celtic language in the countryside, but its aristocracy becomes increasingly francophone. The final blow of this era falls on Ireland. In 1169, the exiled King of Leinster, Diarmait MacMurchada, invites Anglo-Norman mercenaries led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, to help reclaim his throne. Strongbow's armoured cavalry and Welsh archers shatter Irish forces at Waterford and Dublin. By 1171, Henry II of England arrives to assert royal authority over both his barons and the Irish kings. The Anglo-Norman colony takes root in eastern Ireland, its stone castles and manorial villages transforming the landscape. Celtic Ireland does not vanish. Gaelic lords retain power across much of the west and north, but the island's political independence is fractured beyond recovery. The castles rise like stone fists along the Welsh coast. At Cynarfon, concentric walls of banded limestone and sandstone echo the fortifications of Constantinople, a deliberate imperial statement. At Harlech, a fortress perches on a cliff above the sea, its supply gate opening onto a stairway cut into rock, descending 200 feet to the water. At Conwy, 21 towers and 3 barbicans enclose a walled town planted with English settlers. These are the works of Edward I, built between 1283 and 1295 at staggering cost, over £80,000, more than 10 times the Crown's annual income from Wales. They are not merely military installations. They are the architecture of permanent subjugation, designed to ensure that Welsh princes never again challenge English dominion, as Llywelyn ap Gruffudd had done before his death in 1282. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 imposed English criminal law on Wales while permitting Welsh civil law in property disputes, a calculated erosion. Welsh was not banned, but power now spoke English and Latin. When Owain Glyndwr raised the last great Welsh revolt between 1400 and 1415, proclaiming himself Prince of Wales and summoning a parliament at Machynlleth, his defeat brought penal statutes barring Welsh speakers from holding office in English boroughs. The Acts of Union of 1536 and 1543 completed the legal absorption. Wales became formally part of England, English became the sole language of courts and administration, and Welsh gentry increasingly adopted English to access power. In Ireland, the Anglo-Norman colony contracted through the 14th century into the Pale, a fortified enclave around Dublin. The Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 attempted to prevent the colonists from adopting Irish language, dress, and law, a measure revealing how thoroughly Gaelic culture had absorbed its would-be conquerors. Beyond the Pale, Gaelic lords ruled as before, but the Tudor reconquest transformed the island. Plantation schemes under Elizabeth and James settled English and Scottish Protestants on confiscated Irish land, most devastatingly in Ulster after the flight of the Earls in 1607, when the last great Gaelic chieftains, the O'Neill and O'Donnell lords, sailed into permanent exile on the continent. Oliver Cromwell's campaign of 1649 to 1653 broke Catholic Ireland with massacre and mass land confiscation. The phrase "to hell or to Connaught" captured the policy. Catholic landowners were driven west of the Shannon onto the poorest soil. By 1660, Catholic ownership of Irish land had fallen from 60% to 8%. The penal laws enacted after the Williamite War further stripped Catholics of rights to education, property inheritance, and public worship. Irish survived as the language of the dispossessed, spoken in fields, at hedge schools hidden behind ditches, in prayers whispered where no magistrate could hear. In Scotland, the Gaelic-speaking Highlands maintained clan society into the 18th century, a world of cattle, kinship obligation, and martial tradition. The Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745 tied Highland Gaelic culture to a doomed political cause. After Culloden in 1746, the British state dismantled Highland society systematically, banning tartan, disarming clans, abolishing heritable jurisdictions. The Highland clearances that followed over subsequent decades emptied glens of their people, replacing communities with sheep. In Brittany, the French crown had absorbed the duchy in 1532. Breton persisted as the language of peasants and fishermen, while French dominated administration and education. The Revolution of 1789, proclaiming one republic and one language, actively suppressed regional tongues. Breton, like Welsh and Irish and Gaelic, retreated into the domestic sphere, the chapel, the lullaby. By 1800, every Celtic language occupied a diminished territory. None had vanished entirely. In stone-walled schoolrooms and smoky cottages, in fishing villages on Atlantic headlands, and in mountain farms above cloud level, millions still spoke the tongues that had once echoed from Galatia to the Western Sea. The languages bent under centuries of pressure, but they did not break. The 19th century dawns, and with it a paradox. The very forces that nearly extinguished Celtic tongues, print culture, nationalism, historical scholarship, now become instruments of their resurrection. In the green valleys of Wales, the Eisteddfod tradition, revived in 1819 at Carmarthen and formalised as the National Eisteddfod from 1861 onward, transforms bardic competition into a mass cultural institution. Thousands gather annually to hear poetry composed in Welsh, to crown bards in ceremonies that consciously echo medieval precedent. The language that English schoolmasters punished with the Welsh Not, a wooden placard hung around a child's neck for speaking their mother tongue, becomes a badge of national pride on the Eisteddfod stage. Across the Irish Sea, a deeper political awakening stirs. In 1893, Douglas Hyde founds the Gaelic League, dedicated to the de-Anglicization of Ireland through language revival. Classes spring up in Dublin parlours and rural halls. The movement feeds directly into the broader current of Irish nationalism. William Butler Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory draw on the old mythological cycles, Cuchulainn, Deirdre, the Tuatha Dé Danann, to forge a literary renaissance in English that paradoxically rekindles pride in Gaelic heritage. The Abbey Theatre opens in 1904. Celtic mythology walks the modern stage. Political consequence follows cultural awakening. The Easter Rising of 1916, the War of Independence, and the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 produce the Irish Free State in 1922, the first Celtic-speaking territory to achieve modern sovereignty. The new state enshrines Irish as its first official language, establishes Gaeltacht regions for its preservation, and makes its study compulsory in schools. In Scotland, the Highland Land League of the 1880s fights for crofters' rights, and Gaelic identity becomes intertwined with land reform. The 20th century brings slower political change. A Scottish Parliament reconvenes only in 1999, nearly 3 centuries after the Act of Union dissolved it. Yet Scottish Gaelic persists in the Hebrides and Western Highlands, supported after 1975 by Gaelic medium education and later by the Gaelic Language Act of 2005. Brittany's path runs through French centralization. The Breton cultural movement MSAV emerges in the late 19th century, producing journals, grammars, and dictionaries. Suppressed during both World Wars, tainted by collaboration accusations after 1944, Breton activism revives in the 1960s and 70s. D1 immersion schools open in 1977, teaching entirely through Breton. The language remains classified as severely endangered, yet tens of thousands still speak it along the Atlantic coast. Cornwall witnesses perhaps the most remarkable revival. Cornish had fallen silent as a community language by the late 18th century. Yet in 1904, Henry Jenner publishes a handbook of Cornish, and through the 20th century scholars reconstruct the language from medieval texts. By 2002, the United Kingdom government recognizes Cornish under the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. Hundreds now speak it. Children grow up in it. On the Isle of Man, the last native speaker of Manx, Ned Madrill, dies in 1974. The language is declared extinct, yet revivalists refuse to accept the verdict. Manx medium schooling begins, and by the 21st century, several hundred fluent speakers exist, a language brought back from clinical death. Today, over 800,000 people speak Welsh in daily life. Irish holds constitutional primacy in a sovereign republic. Celtic festivals draw millions across 6 nations. The knotwork and spirals of Latene art adorn modern jewelry, tattoos, public monuments. Celtic musical traditions, the harp, the pipes, the Sean Nose singing, thrive in concert halls and village sessions alike. 3,000 years after Hallstatt chieftains first worked iron above alpine salt mines, the thread remains unbroken. Frayed, knotted, stretched thin across centuries of conquest and clearance, but unbroken. The Celtic world endures not as a museum relic, but as a living inheritance, carried forward in the mouths of speakers, the hands of artists, and the memory of peoples who refused to forget. Thank you for joining this journey through 3 millennia of Celtic history. If these stories have moved or informed you, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next.